Good evening to all of us at the from Konkan to Coromandel webinar, the community that forms around here once a month. First, let me begin by thanking the Center for Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge and Vivek Gupta, who is my co-host on this seminar, and also, of course, Neil Cunningham, who so kindly runs it with such great efficiency and grace. And I also like to thank the participants who of the seminar who come regularly from different time zones and parts of the world and make themselves present and engage with the scholars' work. So today we have Anaïs de Fonseca, who is a scholar at SOAS in London, University of London. And she is presenting a talk titled Transformation at the Heart of Tradition, Cheriyal Paintings from Telangana, India. And this is a project which I have been engaged at the sidelines with, watching her work and build it up with over several years. And I'm really thrilled that she's finished it and she's working now on a monograph. So just to give you anybody who's not aware, just briefly introduce the paper's topic. It's in Telangana, which was once part of Andhra Pradesh, basically Telugu-speaking region. Itinerant storytellers used to narrate genealogies of the local caste using scroll painting on cloth as a visual aid to their performance. So this is unusual for our seminar to have a living tradition that is both performative, painted, and so explicitly casted in the discussion. So that's something really very exciting for us, right? And Telangana can't be any more at the heart of the Deccan than it is, right? So that's pretty fantastic. Itinerant in the local cast using the in the early 1980s, the All-India Handicrafts Board, a very critical player across India, especially at that time period, developed an interest in these paintings as part of their initiatives for the sustainability of Indian handicrafts. The board's intervention increased the visibility of the paintings, pushing the performances to a secondary position, and coined the tradition of Cheriyal paintings. So this is a tradition at the heart of transformation, right? The emphasis on the material culture of this tradition permitted their entry to museums and the market and initiated what I call the institutionalization of Cheriyal paintings. This paper presents some of the changes in the tradition and the pictorial response to social transformations that took place through since the intervention of the All-India Handicrafts Board. And this is part of a larger phenomenon of urbanization, rural art forms becoming urbanized in new and different ways at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. Across a series of examples of contemporary Cheriyal paintings, this paper explores the tradition's dynamic response. That would be the artists and the way that they conceive and know tradition and represented to social changes in contemporary India, and argues that the dynamism is what has ensured its continuity over time. Thank you so much, Anaïs, for coming to us and presenting your beautiful work.
Thank you, and thanks to you, Annapurna and Vivek also for inviting me to present. You know, I was just telling you, it's been a while I haven't talked about Cheriyal painting, so I'm really, really happy and excited to do that now. And thanks, Neil, for your technological support. I think I'll just share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. Are you all able to see it?
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
So Annapurna already gave, a pretty good introduction of what I'll be talking about. Cheriyal painting, a tradition of scroll paintings from Telangana in South India that was coined, as Cheriyal. So we know it as Cheriyal in the 1980s when the Indian government and the All-India Handicraft Board specifically initiated this variety of activities to revive and support the handicrafts in general across India, but specifically this particular tradition. At that time, Cheriyal was the last village in which these paintings were produced, which is why it was named after Cheriyal. in practice in the past, they were coming from the whole region, and potentially it's hard to trace the history, but potentially from further down, further south in Andhra Pradesh as well. So what this paper suggests specifically, and the title, I think, of the presentation is quite explicit that way, is that transformation rather than fixity is what ensures the continuity of this particular tradition, but of traditions in general. And I'm saying that because craft and folk traditions are often associated with a past that is fixed in time and usually unchanged, and also limited to a series of conservative hereditary practices, and therefore less or not innovative at all. And this is really what this type of research challenges. Thanks to the pioneering work of someone very special to me and to Annapurna, I think Jatindra Jain, the last 20-30 years has seen a lot of this research on living tradition cropping up, and an expansion of the field really of these traditions. And of the idea that tradition is compatible with contemporaneity and with change. So there's a number of studies of these particular craft practices, and again, for those interested, you can get in touch with me. I can give you suggestions of other studies such as that follow this idea of tradition and contemporaneity's compatibility. In a way, this research unfolded, and many of the others I have come across as, following the biography of these objects of this particular tradition. So there are movements from the past to the present, the changes in patronage, changes in location, changes in training, technique, material supply. So it really, looked across all these parameters. And all of this, made me reach that conclusion that traditions, and this particular tradition specifically, is highly dynamic and responds to socio-political changes that take place around it. And even when one encounters, fixity and conservatism in this particular tradition, and I'll get to this in a moment with example, it is also a choice. So there's a conscious decision to remain fixed in certain aspects and to not, implement changes. So this is, the reality of this particular tradition that I'm trying to introduce. So this paper, yes, will demonstrate that Cheriyal painting is highly adaptive and transformative, and also that it is this transformative nature that allows the objects, the Cheriyal objects, to move freely between different institutional frameworks, such as the local communities, museums, but also the handicraft market. And I'll try to give you some examples of all of this. And also to, really link it to what this institution wished or wish to assign to this painting. So there's really a dialogical relation, basically, between the paintings, the painters, and the institutions. Now, in contradiction with this dynamism, with the reality, the dynamic reality of this particular tradition and other traditions, the history of its institutionalization is that of trying to fix it again in the past or in a remote location, basically anywhere where we are not. And craft comes to represent this authentic time and space, a state of things that somewhat is no longer or will soon be no longer. And for that, you'll please forgive me, I'll take a little geographical and historical leap to locate, this way of thinking through craft in the 19th century Europe, really. So I'll spend just, 8-9 minutes to explain you where I'm coming from with this, because I think it's important to understand also the ground on which we start studying this tradition from outside of Europe. So if we look at this, Orientalist painting by the French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme from 1887, for instance, we are usually trained, at least here in Europe, to see this as a masterpiece of academic painting, okay, which depicts in the mastery of the oil technique and with deep, warm color and very intricate patterns, this imaginary Orient that Europe creates at that time. What we might not see at first in this painting, in this imaginary setup, is that the Orient is represented by a rug or several rugs, the one hanging on the wall and those on the floors. And these are handicrafts. These are, used for their decorative properties and for the fact that they represent, they are representative tools, either an earlier stage of civilization or its slow degradation. And to add to this, at that time, we of course know the author of this painting, which is, this Orientalist painter, again, Jean-Louis Giraud. But we have no indication of who might have woven, the hands, probably the hands of multiple women who are behind the making of such artifacts. And the 19th century is also the century of the great exhibitions, with the first one in 1851, in London, where all the artifacts coming from the colony could be, appreciated by general audience and also sold. So there's an important economic dimension associated to the handicraft at that time. And the great exhibitions were particularly key in developing this definition of craft and tradition in the 19th century, as we somewhat understand it today, still, unfortunately, in many ways. There's an interesting article by McGowan that discusses these exhibitions and specifically how traditional Indian designs at that time came to be a range of invariable patterns representing, and I quote her here, traditionalizing rather than traditional design. So there's really, a will to reinforce, to create almost, to fabricate tradition and traditional design specifically. Which, that McGowan does very well in the article. She explains that at that time, even Indian craftsmen and artisans and designers wished for simpler forms. But then on the other side, Europe was commissioning, extra traditional and traditionalizing design. And this, attitude, traditionalizing and preservationist attitudes towards craft have served to entertain this idea that traditions are under threat and that they must be preserved in the face of rapid disappearance. And this is a formulation that's been maintained by a lot of Victorian art critics of the time. So I've just put some examples of publications of the time, but Birdhood and Kumaraswamy specifically are, behind this idea also that, at the origin of the idea that the Indian and more particularly the Hindu, village is the answer to this evil threat of industrialization at the time. And why I'm, saying all of this is because when we shift to India more specifically, and a few decades later in the 1920s, handicrafts and handlooms specifically become an important symbol, important symbols of resistance on the way to independence. And Gandhi and the Swadeshi movement, encouraged local production and, even weaving, the practice of spinning, and the consumption of local hand-spun and hand-woven fabric cloth, in opposition to British imports that were tarnishing the economy at that time. And what Gandhi again was specifically, defending at that time, and which remains, the base for the continuity of craft and handloom institutionalization in post-independent India, was the necessity again to preserve the Indian and understood once again as Hindu village structure, where the handicraft and handloom industries were located. When India gained independence in 1947, then the new government set up a whole range of institutions to support and promote the handicraft and handlooms, amongst which the All-India Handicraft Board in 1952, the National Handicraft and Handlooms Museum in Delhi in 1956, which is the Crafts Museum, known as the Crafts Museum today, and the Weaver Service Center in the same year, then the Craft Council of India in 1964, and there are plenty more, just giving you some examples. And all these institutions were, set up with this very same idea that crafts are under threat and need support, and that as a representative of the nation, this time it should be maintained by the nation. And at the same time, slightly later in the 1980s, specifically, handicraft increasingly were recognized as an important source of export, particularly with the rise of tourism, and this salvaging paradigm was incorporated into marketing narratives. And now you have like handicraft outlets, crafts fairs, social entrepreneurs, public and private sectors together, that continue using this discourse on craft's authenticity and disappearance. And that rhetoric is, still very much present. And whether this is, true in reality or not, when you visit, craftsmen houses in India, you're usually welcomed by a few words on, what the tradition is and how rooted it is, where it comes from, followed by a few words on how precariously, surviving the last practicing family are now living. And this is exactly how I was welcomed in 2012 when I first visited Cheriyal, when I first came to Cheriyal as a fresh PhD. So this was also kind of my assumption, on the basis of the upbringing I had in Europe with this and the legacy of the 19th century Europe, and on the basis of what craftsmen were portraying in front of me as well. And now this paper comes as a contrast to that. Really, it's what I was about to discover in the following year was very different, and it's the dynamism of this tradition that I want to lay in front of you today. But let's shift to the actual, painting that I've come to talk about. So, as I said, when the All-India Handicraft Board began its documentation and its, initiative to support the practice, the last place where they were found, these paintings, was in Cheriyal. So I've put it on the map so you get an idea of where it's located, and I've put on the side a photograph of Vaikunthan Nakash, who's now the oldest master Cheriyal painter. That's in his home in 2012. These paintings were used in the context of performances of local genealogical narratives by troops of storytellers for their patrons. So it puts together really three different communities and different castes as well. So the painters, or let me start from the patrons. So the patrons who would commission a performance to troops of storytellers that belong to the same caste but are from a lower, interdependent. They're interdependent, but they become to a lower section of the same caste. And so the performance is commissioned by the patrons to the performers. The performers may or may not commission a new scroll for the performance. A scroll may be used for decades. In the case of a commission, then they would go to the painters who belong to a different caste. And then commission a new scroll. So this is how it functions. It really puts together, it's an ecosystem, of the region, different communities together. So when the board started this documentation, as I said, the last painting center was Cheriyal, and the life of, at that time, the life of craftsmen making these paintings, but also that of the storytellers, was a concern for the board. Now their intervention, what it did is that it initiated the process of institutionalization of the material culture of that tradition together. It comes as performance and paintings together. But what the board did is really insist on promoting the paintings. So in a way, it detached it from its original context. And what it did is that it allowed for the painting to somehow be revived, and now they are doing well on the whole. But the counterpart was that the performance then started declining even faster. So there is indeed, the reality is that some aspects of this tradition indeed disappeared or are disappearing, and some others are, being revived and in a way doing better even than in the 1980s when the board encountered it. So Cheriyal painting is one such example. Performers, I mean, when I began the project, this is a little bit of a personal anecdote, but when I began the project, I wanted to document both together, what the performance had become now and what the painting had become. And I took a 3-month Telugu course, which was never going to be enough for being able to document the performances. So I had to give up on that aspect, on that dimension of the tradition, which is really, again, insisting only on what I've just said, is that the paintings received quite a lot of attention. And there are a few of us working on the painting tradition, much less working on the performances. My sense is that performances are now still happening, but either on very specific instances of commissions and not necessarily from the patrons, but from, people interested in documenting it, and potentially at festivals or, in again, the tourism / performance of culture context. But on the whole, performers have taken up other professions and have really, left the profession, unlike the painters who continue. So the narratives, okay, this is an image of, it's a screenshot of a recording, so it's not a very good quality, but it gives you a sense of how it would be in the context of performance. And on the side is a detail of the oldest scroll we have. So the narratives depicted on the scrolls are the genealogies of the communities who commissioned the performance. These patrons are the local weavers or washermen, cowherders, or the different, occupational castes of the region. Depending on the myths associated with the community, the origin of the caste's occupation is then traced back to the necessity for an important deity to receive the service of that caste. And this is usually, okay, this is a whole scroll, to give you a better sense of how it looks. And so this necessity, for the service of that caste is usually mediated through the intervention of a sage or a hero. And here I've put an example of the Padmasali Puranam scroll, which is the scroll of the weaver's caste. And Bhavana Rishi is the sage, that comes as this mediator. I mean, I can't retrace the whole narrative right now, but this is, he has a key role in connecting, the caste, the weaver caste, with the deities of the major, with a more important deity of the Hindu pantheon. And that is how, the service of and the emergence of that caste that provides this service becomes, important through the mediation of the sage. The background, okay, this back, the background of the paintings of all these scrolls are systematically read, and they have very contrasting, bold colors for the figures, which can be justified because, the audience sits far away, and also because of, historical tradition of South Indian paintings on temples, etc. But this is, again, something I don't have time to cover here. Usually, not usually, every time these scrolls, the registers, it's divided into registers with a floral border, and the figures are circled with a very, fluid and, I don't know, special black line that is very, that gives these scrolls their visual identity. So, as I already mentioned, when I began the research, I was under the assumption that
Shall we start?
was, unchanged and disappearing.
Just give it 1 minute for just everything to even out, and for everybody, any stragglers might be a...
So I started looking at scrolls over time, and the only one we had across, across history was the one of the Padmasali, so the weavers once again. We had the oldest one from 1625, and then we had other examples in the 18th and 19th century. 18th century mainly, and then we had some from the 2000s that were, produced around the time I was doing fieldwork. So at the level of the narrative, what I observed, so I dissect each of these scrolls and, you know, the order of the scenes, etc., is that it was indeed almost entirely identical. The narrative was completely unchanged over centuries, which I was very happy to discover. And, you know, it was proving my point that there was very little change.
Annapurna, I think you
the
can go
changes
ahead.
appeared
Okay.
at the stylistic level, and, you know, yeah, I mean, you can see it on the examples I've put. Stylistic level, changes in the pigment quality, but the iconography really and the overall organization remain the same. And then, you know, of course, this was paired with an understanding of the role of these scrolls for the communities. And I understood that this fixity, you know, in the narrative was very much, you know, or the lack of change, you know, in the narrative was very much a choice linked to the function of these scrolls. And this is something really important. These scrolls, you know, at the same time record the genealogical narratives of these communities, and they also serve a process of legitimization of this caste group and a certificate for this caste group. So it follows the example of, if you think of, you know, written, you know, like Puranas, so the old scroll, the old narratives of certain upper caste narratives, say. This is in a way a visual, you know, counterpart to that for communities that, you know, traditionally may not have been literate. So they have this visual certificate, a sacred visual certificate of the existence of their community, which is why, in a way, fixity is very much a need for it, to prove that the narrative, that genealogy is the same, and this community, you know, has, I mean, still, you know, traces its genealogy in this higher Hindu pantheon, you know. So at the same time, yeah, legitimizing and certifying, you know, of the caste existence. So that was, I mean, art historical, you know, methods, you know, helped me to understand that fixity had a role, you know, very much related to the function of these objects. Now, what I want to do in the following example is, you know, take a step away from what these scrolls were originally, or at least for some, you know, for some time. There were also paintings on temple walls traditionally. So I've not put some examples, but they were still painted on the walls of temples for these communities as well. So the following example I will show you. There are 4 or 5 case studies. I mean, there are more, of course, but I've selected 4 or 5 to, you know, take a step away from this and really this time looked at specific trajectories that pushed, you know, the parameters of Cheriyal outside of the boundaries that they were traditionally, and outside the boundaries that craft institutions have tried, you know, to make us understand that these were. So the first example comes from a commission made for a commission of the Ramayana, you know, 10 panels for the Ramayana for a museum called the Ramkatha Museum in Ayodhya. So it's a small provincial museum under the state government of Andhra Pradesh that opened in 1988. And I mean, this is a photo of the complex in which the museum is located. It's on the left. It's an archaeological museum that proposes, you know, historical, in quote unquote, evidence of the existence of Rama's sanctuary in the town through the exhibition of or the display of excavation findings. It also documents the life of Rama and how it's connected to the city of Ayodhya. Now, the story of how this set entered this museum collection is what I found particularly interesting, and I want to narrate to you. Ayodhya is, you know, I don't know if you know about that, all of you, but most of us would, I'm sure, has been the site of communal violence between Hindus who have claimed the place, you know, as being the location of Ram's birth, on previously what was a mosque, which led to its destruction in 1992, and then the agreement of the construction of a temple that is now, you know, on the way at the moment. So it's a very, it's a place with a very complicated political history. And having that in mind, when the painters told me that they had produced a work for this museum, having that in mind, the past of violence in the town, the current Hindutva politics, I had assumed that the set that was commissioned would be canonizing a particular story of the Ramayana, to support this idea that Ayodhya was the place of birth of Ram, etc., linking to the politics of the town. And so I went there and interviewed the curator, and I realized that the significance of this particular set was somewhere else. It's still connected to the politics of the town, but located somewhere else than in this, canonical narrative of the Ramayana. So the museum curator explained that he regularly traveled to Delhi and to a place where all the handicraft emporiums are put together, the state handicraft emporium, so the ones from Telangana, the one from Andhra Pradesh, the one from West Bengal, etc. And there he was searching for every craft production that narrated or related to the Ramayana in its broad sense, and then would purchase it and then bring it back to the museum. This is how he encountered the set produced by the Cheriyal painter in the Lepakshi Emporium, which is at that time the joint emporium for Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And the set was on display there, and he just acquired it from there. So there was no indication on the part of the curator or the museum given to the painters on what exactly the narrative should be. The narrative had been, the Ramayana that was depicted was the one of the Cheriyal painters produced for the handicraft market. And then, the museum went to this handicraft showroom to purchase it. So instead, I reached the conclusion that the interest of the museum was not on asserting, one version of the story, but perhaps, more to just bring together all the Ramayanas from all over India and use this diversity, of the narrative of this epic of the Ramayana as a proof of its validity. So instead of using one, version of the story, using the fact that the story had many different iterations, to use it, as a support for insisting on the validity of this narrative. So in the museum, there was a large amount of objects of different types of Ramayana from India, from different, craft and traditions. So there was a Kalankari Ramayana, a shadow puppetry Ramayana. There was a mask from Kerala Ramayana, etc. Tanjore painting Ramayana. And there were also artifacts from Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia, who also have the traditional Ramayana. And I'm sorry, I'm not showing you the actual set. So this is, again, I will not detail the narrative to you because it will take so much time, but I've written about it. So for those interested, I'm always happy to share. And another point I want to make on this set is that if we just take a few minutes on the style of the paintings, is we see that, and that's something that the painters have very much insisted upon when they discuss this set with me, is that it's the style of miniature. So again, in inverted commas, and the craftsmen, the Cheriyal craftsmen, several times have painted and even received awards for having painted Cheriyal paintings in the style of miniature, which is recognized across India and across South Asia actually as a very as a classical and fine style of painting. So this example and this example of this example of the set of the Ramayana for this museum is important for many reasons, because it's deeply rooted, the deeply rooted caste narratives of Telangana have been transposed into this pan-Indian epic of the Ramayana. And because the inclusion of Ramayana from Telangana would mean that this narrative is part of the culture of the most remote corners of the country. The Ramayana belongs, to most remote corners of the country, hence supporting the Hindutva homogenization project. And because this was made possible also through the widely recognized style of of miniature painting in a way, to the extent that, you know, this can be emulated in its own context again. And of course, all this was made possible, you know, through a handicraft outlet, which is the Lepakshi Emporium. And most of the examples I'm showing you today are also, you know, have been somehow related to handicraft outlets, emporiums, and to the handicraft market as a whole. So they're always somewhat in the picture, you know, when we understand the biography of this particular commission and objects. And this is, yeah, it is a more recent one. So when it had already, when Telangana and Andhra Pradesh had already split, so Lepakshi remained the emporium for Andhra Pradesh, and then, you know, Telangana had another one open a bit later. Another example, I'm just checking the time to be sure I'm doing okay. Another example I want to discuss briefly is this commission of a mural for the Sri Venkateshwara College in Delhi. That was, you know, completed in 2014. This college is under the, I mean, its construction and the yearly maintenance is owned to a South Indian Hindu temple known as the, I mean, a temple trust known as Tirumala Tirupati Devashtanam, which also runs the important pilgrimage site of Sri Venkateshwara Temple at Tirupati, just for information. So it is linked, you know, to a religious site as well. And stylistically, you know, the set follows the conventions of Cheriyal painting. So the red background, the borders, registers, you know, bold figures, the, you know, black line, etc. And what's curious about this one is that it was commissioned to a painter called Madhu, who is not originally coming from the Nakashi caste of painters of Cheriyal paintings. He was trained as part, you know, in the 1980s, as part of the workshops and the training that the All-India Handicraft Board initiated to, you know, revive and yeah, to sustain basically the craft practice. So he is outside the community. He's also, you know, not a signatory of the documentation that was used to make Cheriyal painting a geographical indication. So Cheriyal painting in, I think, 2014, I'm not too sure now, acquired a geographical indication tag. So it's a you know, in India, some sort of a patent system to recognize and to associate certain craft practices, but also, you know, other elements of culture to a specific place and community. So Madhu is not a signatory of this geographical indication tag for Cheriyal. So he remained outside, not entirely recognized, you know, as a Cheriyal painter by the actual Cheriyal painters, but very much recognized by the market. And again, this commission happened. So the director of the college went to the emporium and requested for someone who would be able to answer this commission. And this is how, you know, the emporium then contacted Madhu and directed him towards the potential commission for this one. So, and what this has allowed, in a way, I mean, again, I cannot, you know, go too much detail into the narrative and into, you know, the details of this painting, but it's made in acrylic, first of all, which is a very different, you know, traditionally they were natural pigments and then later on watercolors, but acrylic is rarely used. It's a more expensive media technique to use. So this is one, you know, important change that happened. And then some narrative devices. So there is this, for example, a staircase that is created here. Then if you see the cursor, that is at the same time a border, but also a staircase. So there's some, you know, innovation in the way this narrative is also depicted. There's attempts at perspective also in this register, you can see here. So all that, you know, was made possible because of this, you know, ambivalent position that Madhu has. as being outside the convention of Cheriyal paintings, and at the same time, knowing, having been trained at it, so he could play with technique and with innovative narrative tools, and then produce this set. The next example I have, but I might have to skip because I think I'm already at 45 minutes. So if you don't mind, I will take you to a more interesting one.
You've got about 5-10 minutes left.
Yeah. So I'll just, you can see the visuals, but I'll discuss the next one a bit more. Good. This is a very interesting case again. So what we have here, it's a completely different, again, one step further from the traditional conventions of Cheriyal paintings. It's a digitized, it's a digitization project, basically. So how it happened is this lady called Brenda Beck, who's a folklorist of Tamil Nadu, launched this project called the Legend of Ponivala. She was reviving a tale from the Kongu Nadu region in the northwest of Tamil Nadu, which usually was traditionally performed for long hours by storytellers, but the performances do not exist there anymore. So she, documented the oral tradition of this particular performance, and decided to create a visual for it. So for that, she wanted, she went to a place called the Dakshina Chitra in South India, near Chennai, a center, like we could say it's some sort of a village, the reproduction of a village, with a big South Indian village with spaces that represent Kerala, spaces representing Tamil Nadu, spaces representing Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, etc. And of course, with the crafts of each of these regions, being displayed there. And it's also an important place, forum for craftsmen, researchers, scholars, artists, everyone, to meet and initiate projects. So Brenda Beck visited this center and requested, asked, the curators and the people working there, I'm looking for a visual tradition who could illustrate this tale that has disappeared. And the Dakshina Chitra directed her to the Cheriyal painters, and that's how they began the digitization project together. So what we have here is really, the creation of a visual archive of a disappearing tale. And that is being done through the use of another, visual tradition. So I think this is a fascinating case study that maybe, in decades or centuries would be very, very interesting to look at, because we've taken, two different traditions from two different places and put them together to create a third one. So that's why I really wanted to show you this. And then, of course, if we start, okay, this one as well, I must say brief words on this one. So this painting on the left, once I was sitting with Vaikuntham, with the master craftsman, and he was making this painting. It's like, oh, this is new. It's a single scene, but of this main Ganesh figure that you have on all the scrolls at the beginning of each old scroll, and with this very peculiar blue. So I asked him, okay, what are you doing here today, and what is your plan here? And he said, oh, this man, Jagdish Mittal, who is an important collector of these scrolls, has released a book, and they managed to get hold of the book. And on the book, we can see all our old paintings, and I want to reproduce this. So what he was doing is basically looking at the books and then making copies of it in a different scale, trying to reproduce the colors and the style of the old images that he was seeing. So again, we have this very responsive behavior on the part of the craftsmen, and very dynamic. Like the moment the publication is out, they also, find inspiration from it, and try to, at the same time imitate, but also take some distance from it, innovate, and all this together to produce, another way, another type of painting. And then if you, go on, if you start discussing a little more and asking on which medium, which surface, which, support all painters were painting Cheriyal paintings, then you realize that they were making masks, keychains, saris, and small single scene paintings, and all these are sold, on the handicraft market. So you can find them, these objects in crafts fairs, in emporiums, on the market, the handicraft market, on the internet as well. And I think, these are kind of the last examples. So before I started the research, as I made that very clear to you at the beginning, I had wrongly assumed that this painting practice was dying and in need of documentation. And again, this assumption came from the fact that I was only aware of the scrolls for performances that were indeed decreasing. And, that formed the basis of this government and NGOs rhetoric on the disappearance of craft. And that, that discourse itself had very, very strong roots in colonial ideology and carried out, by everyone interested in supporting handicrafts and handloom, including the craftsmen themselves. Now, looking at the trajectory of continuity and changes in this Cheriyal painting practice and tradition, it's very important, I think, to question this rhetoric of disappearance, but also to, question the parameters that frame craft practices in general as traditional. What exactly does it mean to be traditional? What makes a craft practice or a folk practice traditional? What attached the present to the past? And is it about the visual features, the red background, the borders and the black line that are, these very three visual elements that throughout, no matter what type of Cheriyal paintings you're looking at, you will find those three elements? Or is it the subject matter? Is it the context of production? Or is it the makers, the actual painters who, are the repository of this idea of the tradition? And yeah, I'll conclude, Vivek. Yeah, just.
Thank you. That was really a great, I learned a lot about Cheriyal painting. That's great. So I would love for our, if you want to stop sharing your screen now, we'll open the floor to discussion. So how this works is just type your questions into the chat box and we'll get to your questions as they come in. I just want to start off the discussion by asking you about the term naqash and when does that enter Telugu? It's a Persian word that means painter. So I was like, why? It's a very interesting thing. And then it becomes the name of a caste of painters. When does that happen? How does that, do you know much about that?
I actually do not know when this happens, Vivek, unfortunately, but I've had this discussion with the painters and with others as well. I mean, mainly actually the miniature specialist. And the Naqsh, as you probably know, is the work of the line. So I think at some point the Cheriyal painters have, appropriated this name for the community because their line is so important. And it's important in many of the South Indian mural tradition as well. So if you go to Lipakshi temple in South India, Andhra Pradesh, you will find this very fine work of the line. And usually folk painters across India are called Chitrakar, but in this particular region, and I think that's definitely because of the work of the line, and that's how they explain, and the painters themselves explain it, they've chosen Naqashi. And of course, the region, the Deccan region, very strongly connected to, Islamic art and miniature tradition in general. I think, I suspect a lot of painters must have, crossed and encountered each other. Miniature painters must have encountered other types of painters in the region, and acquiring that name must have also been like the way they are painting miniature today, acquiring some sort of a status, yeah, that's how.
So just a reminder, you can type your questions or raise your hand if you want to ask by voice. As I see no questions, I will ask another one that I have. Is there any evidence that the painters that are working on murals also work on temple on the scrolls also work in temple murals? Because that the early the early scroll from the Jagdish Mittal collection looks so similar to what you see in much of the work that Anna Seastrand has done in temples. So even the way that it's organized, like these different registers, and it's very similar to that, and it's also similar to textiles that are circulating at around that period.
So again, I mean, we cannot say with certainty that these very same painters, so the Nakashis, were the one, painting on temple walls or ceilings. But there is definitely a genealogy. I mean, there is a connection between the two and between the textile tradition. So kalamkari is strikingly, similar as well in many ways. What was the second part of your question, Vivek?
It was just whether there was any evidence for these nakashis moving between various media, and he's basically said there isn't.
There is a curious case I encountered a while ago of two kalamkaris of one of the narrative called the Katam Rajukatha that was also depicted on a scroll, and also as a set of wooden figurines. So I had three different support, basically three different manifestations, say, of the same narrative, which gave me a hint that definitely they were working across different media. Now there is no evidence for the actual temple paintings and ceilings that I have not found, but definitely. And today, so Vaikuntam's father moved from one village to Cheriyal in the former village where he used to live. He was a temple painter, but painting the walls of temples of the middle and lower castes. And that we know for sure, because I've seen them even today. The painters continue painting the small, shrines of the middle and lower castes. But again, evidences of the larger temples like Lepakshi or, is not, I haven't found.
We have some wonderful questions coming in from Banu Parpia, who asks, do you have evidence of a horizontal format for these scrolls? Do you know how the early scrolls were disposed of in the 17th or 18th century? Were there ceremonies for disposal by immersion in the sacred rivers or bodies of water?
Yes and yes. So we have horizontal scrolls. Scroll, I would say, okay, of this particular narrative I was just mentioning, the Katam Rajukatha, which on kalamkaris, they're also, so on kalamkaris, how they are depicted is as a one, the hanging is open at once, not unfolded. So we could say that it's horizontal. The registers are horizontally, depicted, painted, but on the whole, it's a one-off visual experience. And then recently, while I was on field work, the Cheriyal painters were producing one of this very same narrative horizontally. And I asked them, why is this one horizontal while all the others are vertical? And they said because that is how the performers requested it. So again, I mean, usually it's not up to the painters to decide how the scroll is organized. I mean, I've not mentioned that in the presentation, but it's on the part of it's the decision of the performers. So yes, there is at least one evidence of a horizontal one, but which is a very specific narrative connected to other, types of performances as well. And when they are too old to be used, they are disposed in water with a ceremony. So they are sacred objects, and they are not, I mean, nowadays they keep them and they sell them as well, but yeah, traditionally they are disposed in water as sacred objects. And while not in use, when the performance is not happening, they also kept in specific corners of houses and etc., and folded in specific paper, etc. So sacred objects.
Banu, thanks you very much. And they, like, I think a lot of us are looking forward to the publication of a lot of this material because first of all, it's incredibly visual, and second of all, it's so interesting to think about it in relationship to various media. Now, Dr. Nirmala Biluka says, just wanted to add a credit to the artist Kondapalli Sheshadri Rao, who you might know, who introduced this Nakashi art to Jagdish Mittal in 1954, who was writing primarily in Telugu. We have a question from Dr. Susan Bean, who is a great scholar of craft, who says, really enjoyed your presentation. If change is part of tradition, are there any limits? Can something change too much, or can it become so static that it is no longer a living tradition?
I think the perhaps when it becomes too static, then yes, it is no longer a living tradition. But I think, I mean, what I am observing from this and from other, studies I have read about of different traditions, mainly it's the discourse we make of this, that will decide that in a way. And institutions, from one institution to the other, they'll have different, discourse around whether this is the same tradition or not. I think the way I've worked on the monograph is slightly, I mean, when I did the PhD, my idea was that institution had a very big role in determining whether this is still the same tradition or not. And the way, I've been thinking about this now I completed the PhD 5 years ago, so it's been a while. And the way I'm changing my thoughts now is that I think it's the makers that have this agency of deciding whether this is still the same tradition or not. And I think that's a very strong, argument I would like to make and keep for the monograph, is that I think it's up to them to decide if that's the same tradition or not. I don't know if that answers your question, but
we have quite a few other credits coming through beyond Jagdish Mittal. So Professor Jayadhar Thirumal Rao has some scrolls, and an artist Lakshman Ale too. They're not seeing any other questions in the chat. I'm just going to look one more time to see whether there are. In this case, I will take the opportunity to ask one last question for you, Anaïs. What's really interesting is that, Susan Bean says maybe we need a new term for tradition.
Yes, or a new definition, or we need to be, every time we discuss tradition, to have this disclaimer on what we mean by it. I think it's one of those terms that like the folk, like craft, that is really, really, really difficult to define, and where it's actually quite productive and trying to define it.
I mean, it's also quite messy because it's only because of that somewhat violent traditionalizing act that you even have access to some of the older scrolls, like that we can only study them because of they weren't ritualized in a certain way. So there is a tension there that I think your own attention to the institutional politics really draws out. So if there are no questions in the chat, I just want to say, please join me in thanking Dr. Anaïs de Fonseca for this fantastic lecture today. If you missed part of it, we will be posting it online later, and we'll be back in the winter with a fresh slate of events. And if you missed any of the lectures this term, you please check out the our YouTube page. I think both of the other lectures are online. I just want to thank, in addition to Anaïs, Neil Cunningham at the Center of Islamic Studies, as well as my co-collaborator on this project, Dr. Annapurna Garimella in Hyderabad, who's actually the person who brought Anaïs and I together. All right, thank you so much. And I just also wanted to mention Renu Park, who just mentioned that we need to send the links in advance. Yes, last week we had a little bit of a technical difficulty, but it was sorted out this week. So thank you so much, Anaïs, and that's all for today.